"Sir, that piano's for real musicians," the violinist barked, tilting his chin with theatrical disdain. He was lean, middle-aged, and wore a scarf too large for his frame. His violin case sat open nearby with a few crumpled dollars inside. He'd played in this corner of Grand Central Station for over a decade. His stage, his territory, his turf. So when the old man in the weather-worn hoodie slowly approached the upright piano tucked beside track 23, heads turned. Not out of interest but amusement. The old man didn't respond to the insult. He just stared at the piano like it was an altar in a cathedral. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out and ran his fingers along the dusty, yellowing keys. A few of the keys were chipped, one was missing altogether. The violinist snorted. "It doesn't even work right. It's just for show." The man didn't move, didn't look at him. His silence was unnerving. A security guard nearby began to stir. Tall, thick-necked, and bored, the guard had seen it all. Dancers, magicians, loud kids, a guy who once brought an actual goat through the station. But this, an old man about to slap the ghost of a melody out of a broken public piano, that he couldn't let slide. "Hey sir," the guard said as he strolled over, "let's not touch the piano today, okay? We got a film crew coming through here in 20 minutes and I don't need a crowd forming." The old man finally turned to look at him. His eyes were not tired, they were quiet. There was a difference. They had the silence of someone who'd once held the world in his hand and then let it fall. He nodded slowly, then turned back to the piano. "Just one song," he said, his voice cracked like dry wood. The guard paused. Something about the man's tone stopped him from finishing his usual lecture. He folded his arms but didn't interrupt. The old man eased onto the bench. It creaked under his weight. The station was never silent, not in the traditional sense. There were always announcements, the hiss of brakes, the click of shoes on marble. But when he lifted the piano cover, even the train seemed to pause, as though curious what might happen next. No one knew him, and that was the point. He was once Thomas Mitchell, the quiet millionaire behind Mitchell Music Distribution, a company that revolutionized how independent artists reached audiences worldwide. His fingers had once conducted business meetings that launched careers, signed contracts that changed lives, composed strategies that built an empire worth $50 million. But that was before everything. Before he lost her. After that day he sold his company, closed his penthouse, and disappeared from the world with only a small trust left for his daughter. The press called it a midlife crisis. The board called it insanity. But Thomas called it survival. He had walked into the station not for the music, but for her memory. And this piano, this broken, half-forgotten piano tucked beside travelers rushing to their destinations, it was the only place left where he could reach her. He placed his hands above the keys, hovering, not playing yet. Just listening. "Go ahead, maestro," the violinist scoffed, throwing in a sarcastic bow. "Show us your masterpiece." Thomas pressed a single note. It was dead. Silent. He shifted slightly, found a different key. A cracked high C. It sang barely. He smiled softly. Then, like a whisper slipping through fog, he began to play. The melody didn't rush. It tiptoed out, delicate, unsure, trembling like a bird testing a branch. A few heads turned. Not many. Just enough. Enough to begin that invisible thread that connects soul to soul through sound. The left hand stumbled at first. Age had not been kind to his joints. But the right hand remembered. Remembered her. The song was not famous. It had never been recorded. She had written it on a scrap of paper one rainy night, barefoot, dancing in their kitchen. It was a lullaby, unfinished. She meant to write more, but that morning she collapsed. A rare condition. Silent. Sudden. By the time he brought the hospital piano to life for her in the recovery room, she was already slipping away. And now, here in the station where she first said, "I love you," as his concert ended 2 decades ago, Thomas played the only thing he had left of her. A girl in leggings and earbuds paused. She didn't know why. She just stopped. A mother rushing her twin boys slowed as she passed. The violinist stopped tuning. Thomas's eyes were closed, not in performance but in prayer. Every note, every breath between notes was deliberate. Like speaking a language only she could still understand. The crowd didn't gather like an audience. It grew like dawn does. Quiet and inevitable. By the 3rd minute, there were 50 people loosely circled, unsure whether they were intruding on something too private, too sacred to witness. A man in a gray suit lowered his phone. A woman with tired eyes stopped crying. Even the guard didn't move. He just stood with his hands on his belt, shifting awkwardly, eyes fixed on the pianist like he couldn't remember what he was supposed to be guarding against. Then came the part of the song with no written notes. It was the part he'd never played in public. The part where his own grief took over. The right hand repeated the lullaby's refrain. The left hand began to fracture. Minor chords. Unexpected pauses. Broken rhythms. Some would say it was a mistake. But it wasn't. It was morning. The melody climbed higher now, reaching for something beyond the cathedral ceiling of the station. Each note was a prayer, a memory, a piece of his heart he was finally brave enough to share. The broken piano responded as if it had been waiting its entire existence for this moment, for these hands, for this story. A businessman stopped mid-stride, his briefcase forgotten at his side. An elderly woman clutched her purse to her chest, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, sensing something sacred was happening, even if they couldn't understand what. The music swelled, not in volume but in emotion. Thomas poured 20 years of silence into those keys. 20 years of conversations he never had, songs he never sang, love he never expressed. The lullaby became a symphony of loss and hope, of endings and beginnings. As the melody began to soften, preparing for its final descent, something extraordinary happened. A young boy, maybe 7 years old, began to hum along. He didn't know the tune, had never heard it before, but somehow his voice found the harmony. His mother looked down in wonder, then up at the pianist with tears in her eyes. Others joined, not with their voices but with their presence. They swayed gently, some with eyes closed, others watching Thomas's hands dance across the broken keys with reverence. The station had become a cathedral, and they were all witnesses to something holy. The final notes came like a sunset, slow and inevitable and beautiful. Thomas held the last chord longer than necessary, as if reluctant to let go. When the sound finally faded into the ambient noise of the station, silence fell like a blanket. There was no applause at first. Just tears. Even the violinist had gone still, his scarf hanging loose around his neck, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked like awe. Then, slowly, like flowers opening to the morning sun, the applause began. Not thunderous but reverent. Some clapped with tears on their cheeks. Some with hands still pressed to their hearts. The little boy who had hummed along clapped the loudest, his face bright with joy. Thomas stood slowly, his body sore but his spirit light. He gave no name, no introduction. He didn't even make eye contact. He simply looked once more at the piano, gently touched the corner of the bench as if blessing it, and turned to leave. The violinist took a step forward. His mouth opened, then closed. Instead, he watched as Thomas disappeared into the station's crowd, an old man in a hoodie who had walked in as a stranger and left with something far more powerful than recognition. Silence fell again, but this time it was full. The security guard stood frozen, his radio crackling with forgotten messages. He'd been working at Grand Central for 15 years, had seen thousands of people pass through these halls, but he'd never seen anything like this. The film crew that was supposed to arrive had been delayed, but it didn't matter now. What had just happened couldn't be captured by cameras anyway. As people slowly began to disperse, returning to their hurried lives and waiting trains, they carried something with them they hadn't arrived with. The businessman picked up his briefcase but walked slower. The mother with the twin boys held them a little closer. The girl with the earbuds removed them entirely, suddenly preferring the natural symphony of the station. The violinist remained by his case, staring at the piano. After a long moment, he walked over and sat on the bench Thomas had just vacated. The keys were still warm. He pressed one gently, then another. The notes were still broken, still imperfect, but somehow they sounded different now. Fuller. More honest. He began to play a simple melody, something he'd learned as a child but had forgotten in his pursuit of complexity and technique. His playing was gentle, humble, as if he was trying to honor what had just taken place. A few passers-by stopped to listen, and he didn't shoo them away. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing for coins in his case. He was playing for connection. Meanwhile, Thomas walked slowly through the underground corridors, his footsteps echoing softly against the tiled walls. He passed advertisements for luxury watches and vacation destinations, reminders of a world he had once been part of but no longer belonged to. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could still afford anything those ads were selling, but money had long since stopped answering the questions his heart was asking. At the subway platform he found an empty bench and sat down heavily. The adrenaline of performing was fading, leaving behind the familiar ache of loss. But it was different this time. Softer. Less sharp. For the first time in 2 decades, his grief felt like something he could carry rather than something that was carrying him. He pulled out his phone, an old model he'd kept long past its expiration date, and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in months. His daughter Sarah, now 35 and living across the country with her own family. She'd been trying to reach out, sending photos of his grandchildren, inviting him to visit. He'd been too lost in his own silence to respond. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Dad? Is everything okay? You never call this late." Thomas smiled, hearing the concern in her voice but also the love. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Better than okay, actually. I played piano today. For the first time since your mother." There was silence on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Dad, that's wonderful. How do you feel?" Like she was listening, he said simply. Sarah's voice broke slightly. She was Dad. She always is. They talked for 20 minutes about everything and nothing. About his grandchildren's school performances, about Sarah's job, about the weather. Normal things. Life things. Things that suddenly mattered again. When he hung up, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for tomorrow. The next morning, Thomas woke in his small apartment with purpose. He'd downsized after selling his company, trading his Manhattan penthouse for a modest place in Queens. He liked the anonymity it afforded him, the way he could disappear into the rhythm of ordinary life. But today felt different. Today he had a mission. He returned to Grand Central not as a broken man seeking solace, but as someone with something to give. He'd spent the night thinking about the faces in that crowd, about the boy who had hummed along, about the security guard who had forgotten to guard anything, about the violinist who had seen his own reflection in a stranger's grief. The piano was still there, still broken, still ignored by the rushing commuters. But Thomas saw it differently now. Not as a forgotten relic but as a bridge. A connection point between souls who needed to remember that music wasn't just entertainment, it was medicine. He sat down and began to play again. Not the lullaby this time but something new. Something that felt like hope. The notes were still imperfect, the keys still uneven, but his playing was stronger, more confident. Within minutes people began to slow down. Not the same crowd as yesterday, but new faces drawn by the same magnetic pull of authentic emotion. A teenage girl with a guitar case stopped and listened. An elderly man leaning on a walker found a nearby bench and closed his eyes. A group of tourists lowered their cameras and simply experienced the moment. Thomas played for an hour, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by the violinist from yesterday who had returned with a new humility in his approach. They didn't speak, didn't plan, just let the music find its own way. When Thomas finally stood to leave, the teenage girl with the guitar case approached him. "Excuse me," she said shyly, "I'm Emma. I heard you yesterday too. The song you played, it reminded me of something my grandmother used to hum. She passed away last year and I haven't been able to play since. But listening to you, it made me remember why music matters." Thomas looked at her guitar case, then back at her hopeful face. "Would you like to play something? With me, I mean. Tomorrow?" Emma's eyes widened. "Really? You'd want that?" "Music isn't meant to be a solo act," Thomas said gently. "It's meant to be shared." And so began what would become known as the Grand Central Sessions, an informal gathering of musicians, listeners, and souls seeking connection. It wasn't planned or promoted. It just grew organically, day by day, note by note. Thomas never revealed his identity, never claimed credit for starting something. He was simply Thomas, the man who played the broken piano. But word spread in the quiet way that meaningful things do. Social media posts appeared with hashtags like #BrokenPianoBeauty and #StationSongs. News outlets picked up the story, calling it a grassroots music movement and a return to authentic performance. But for Thomas it was something much simpler. It was the fulfillment of a promise he'd made to his wife in her final moments, to not let the music die with her, but to help it live in new ways, through new voices, in new hearts. 3 months later, the city announced plans to restore the piano and create a designated performance space in the station. Thomas donated anonymously to the project, ensuring that the spirit of spontaneity and accessibility would be preserved. The last scene finds Thomas exactly where it all began, sitting at the now-restored piano. The keys are fixed, the sound is pure, but the magic remains unchanged. He plays the lullaby one more time, and the station falls silent just as it did that first day. But this time when he finishes, he doesn't leave alone. Emma is there with her guitar, the violinist with his newfound humility, the security guard who now carries a small harmonica, dozens of others who have become part of this accidental family. They stand together in the silence, not as performers and audience, but as human beings who have remembered what it means to truly listen, to truly share, to truly heal. And somewhere in that silence, in that space between the last note and the first breath, love lives on. Because sometimes the most powerful songs aren't the ones we hear, but the ones we remember. the ones that rise from grief, silence, and healing. In this story, a broken piano, a grieving millionaire, and a fearless young guitarist showed us that music is not about perfection, it's about connection. Thomas Mitchell lost everything when his wife passed, including his reason to play. But it took one brave performance at a forgotten train station and one teenager bold enough to believe to reignite a flame the world thought extinguished. Together, they didn't just revive a melody. They resurrected a movement. The true lesson? We're all carrying a song inside us. Sometimes all it takes is a place to be heard and someone to believe we still matter. Whether you're the one playing or the one listening, your story, your silence, your second chance, it all matters. Because when we dare to play our truth, no matter how broken the keys, someone, somewhere begins to heal. So play. Speak. Share your song with the world. You never know whose life you might change with just one note played from the heart, in a moment when they need it most.